Hi. Um, we're in a bit of a state at the moment because, as you can see, we're having a load of plastering done. So everything is in here in boxes. So we will just have to make do, and it's going to be a little bit strange. So I apologise for the strangeness and any noise that you hear. It's a weird situation, but hey-ho, we're all good, and welcome to the Sanctuary Wales podcast on this is the first one of 2021. So here we are, and we're all in lockdown again. So there we are. You probably will hear noises and things in the background, and unfortunately that's by the by. We're gonna start on Daniel this week, and this week and next week I'm gonna be studying Daniel. It's I'm potching around with this because this is rather strange, but there we are. And please excuse all the mess in the background. We're well, as I said, we're in a bit of a state because we've got everything from that living room in this living room as well as the other stuff. So here we go. This is the book of Daniel, and I apologise for the weird angle and the mess. But it's the content that's the main thing. The book of Daniel is a mixture of the best known and the least known parts of the Bible, and parts of Scripture. Everyone knows about the Lion's Den and the fiery furnace, and most people know about Belshazzar's feast, where we get the phrase "the writing on the wall." It's also very easy to understand parts of Daniel, and it's very difficult to understand other parts of Daniel. There are some parts that are easier to understand than others, and there are other parts that are so obscure that people have wrestled with them for years, hundreds of years. Daniel means God has judged, and that's a heck of a name. It's an incredible name. Daniel does pose the question: is the Bible a human book or a divine book? The book of Daniel consists of two parts. As Isaac Newton, in his observations on the prophecies of Daniel, I don't know how many of you realised that Isaac Newton wrote a paper come book on observations of prophecies of Daniel, but he did. He put it: the book of Daniel is a collection of papers written at several times. The last 6 chapters contain prophecies written by Daniel himself. The first 6 chapters are a collection of historical papers written by other authors. and that was Isaac Newton's theory on that. In the stories about him, written in the third person, Daniel, like the biblical Joseph, is a minister to pagan kings, and he was a minister to a number of pagan kings, and an interpreter of signs, of dreams. In the second part, written in the first person, Daniel, like the biblical prophets, records signs seen by himself, and he is unable to understand their meaning. Now, he himself needs an angelic interpreter. So the first half of Daniel is him explaining other people's dreams, and the second half of Daniel is him having his own dreams explained to him by an angelic interpreter, which is really interesting. The Bible is written from by humans for humans, and therefore people treat the Bible as they do any other book. But you can't treat the Bible like that. It's a divine book. It's written by God and about God, and it's inspired by God, even though men wrote it. Therefore, things that are impossible to man but are possible to God figure in the Bible. Only God can do certain things, and only God can say certain things, assuming there is a God. And we've got to say that, because there are lots of people who don't assume that there's a God, and we need to acknowledge that they are around. Only God can do miracles, and only God can suspend natural laws, or interfere with natural laws, or intervene with natural laws that govern cause and effect. Only God can do signs and wonders, and signs and wonders is a way that Daniel references the things that God is doing, which is signs and wonders is a phrase that comes into play in this book particularly. This comes from a Latin word, miras, which means something amazing. So signs and wonders comes from that. Only God can tell us what's going to happen in the future. Man can speculate about this, but only God knows. The book of Daniel covers 75 years of Daniel's life, but it covers 440 years in actual history. Daniel's talking about the future that is covered here with remarkable accuracy, and that has puzzled scholars, biblical scholars, who can't cope with the accuracy of Daniel's prophecies. People say that these stories have no historical value, and they have real spiritual and moral value, but no historical value. And that's how many people treat the miracles of the Bible today. And they treat the prophecies as a record written afterwards, rather than a revelation written beforehand. And you find this in many commentaries written by liberal scholars, that they are talking about, that they say that the predictions were not actually predictions, but they were written later, and they were put into the book of Daniel after the event. And And yet chapter 11 is a series of events which took place centuries after Daniel. And there are 200, near enough 200 details in Daniel 11, every one of which happened centuries later. So how do you explain that? Well, statistically, the coincidence is incredible. These details must either have been written by man afterwards or inspired by God beforehand. And you have to make the choice whether you choose that it's inspired by God or written by man and put in afterwards. I choose to say that they were inspired by God, because to put them in afterwards would be a heck of a lot of work, and it would mean going back and almost forging the paper and the writings of the time. In other words, many people who think this way want to keep the Bible. Many people who think that it's of no historical value and only moral value want to keep the Bible, and they want to keep it for its moral and spiritual values. But they want to cut out the miraculous, but keep the moral part. In other words, live by the Ten Commandments and the Sermon on the Mount, but forget about the miracles and prophecies. Well, I'm afraid you can't do that. You take the Bible as a whole piece of work, or you don't take it at all. There's no point in just cutting out the bits and bobs that you need. I created a real hoo-ha a number of years ago when I was doing a service by ripping a Bible in half and basically saying what people do is they take this half and this half and they adhere to this half of the Bible, and they leave this half alone because they don't like this half, and that doesn't suit their lifestyle. But you can't do that. The offence that I caused by ripping the Bible in half is the offence and greater that you caused to God by taking parts of the Bible and adhering to them and not taking other parts. But many dismiss the Bible as misleading and irrelevant, and historically, it's they see it as a book of lies, and it mustn't be taken in by that. As my plasterer's coming in, so we'll. Good morning, Stuart. Morning. Morning, Di. So people are unwilling to accept the prophetic and miraculous because they're unwilling to accept God. They don't want the supernatural side of Scripture because they would have to live differently if they accepted that. If God is too real in people's lives, they would have to change their ways, and they simply don't want to, so therefore they deny him. The evidence for the resurrection is so strong, the eyewitness accounts and the circumstantial evidence is about 200 times stronger than the evidence that we have for Julius Caesar invading the UK in 55 BC. And yet nobody questions the fact that Julius Caesar invaded England. you all accept that, but you don't accept the resurrection. It's a weird anomaly. Why? Because if they accepted Jesus rose from the dead, they have to change their lives, and he claims for himself. And if you accepted that Jesus raised from the dead, you have to accept his claims for himself, that they must be true, and therefore his claims on himself must be valid. And you can't, or you could ignore Julius Caesar, but you can't ignore Christ. There is a reluctance to accept the spiritual side of things. There is a longing to believe that we are in a closed universe where only things that we can touch and smell and see are true, and everything supernatural is false. Now, Daniel's book, the first thing that strikes you is it is in two halves. The first half is all miracle, and the second half is all prophecy. Those who have difficulty with the supernatural really don't know what to do with the book of Daniel. We have chapters 1 to 6, which we all basically know from Sunday school, and they've got all the stories in them, that Daniel in the lion's den, and Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace, and the writing on the wall. And we don't know much else about the book of Daniel. There are a number of things that you can be said about the two sets of chapters. In the first half, it's mainly miracles. In the second half, it's mainly prophecies. In the first half, it's written mainly in the third person, and the first half is about Daniel. In the second half, it's all written in the first person, and the second half is by Daniel. The first half is what happened during Daniel's life, and the second half is what will happen after Daniel's life. The first half is in the present, and the second half is in the future. The first chapter is in Hebrew, and the next 5 are in Aramaic, which is the language which was used commonly in the ancient world, and it was used everywhere. Aramaic was Hebrew was a specific language used by the Jews, and the Greeks had their own language, but Aramaic spanned the continents. And in the second half, which is really peculiar, the first chapter is in Aramaic, but the rest of the chapters are in Hebrew again. And this tells you who the chapters were directed towards, and where they were meant to be read. This tells you what parts were meant to be widely read by unbelievers, and which were meant to be read by the people of God. And it's not just two equal halves, it's more complex than that. Now let's look at the history. It's very important to realize that not all of the children of Israel were taken into exile together, and they weren't brought back from Israel together either. They were taken to Babylon in three distinct sections, and they came back in 3 lots as well. But actually the total number that came back was vastly smaller than went out. There was almost 1 million people were taken in the deportation of people to Babylon, and about 50,000 came back, which is a minuscule amount. And they left behind them in Babylon a whole Jewish community, which was there until about 20 to 30 years ago. And the wise men who followed the star in Jesus' birth were almost certainly from the Jewish communities in Babylon and that had been left behind. Babylon and back under Nebuchadnezzar in 606 BC, you had the first deportation, and you had a very young Daniel was taken in this deportation, along with Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, and the four of them were being groomed for the Jewish royal house. They were outstanding young men. In 597 BC, Ezekiel was taken in the second deportation, and at that point, around 10,000 were taken, and they were all the dignitaries and the bigwigs. And in the first deportation, it was almost a youth element that was taken. And Ezekiel was a bit younger than Daniel. And in 586 BC, you had the rest of them, the third deportation, and after that, the city and the temple were destroyed. And Daniel never saw his land again. Daniel was taken off to Babylon, and he became established in the palace and was established there under various kings. But in 536 BC, under Zerubbabel, Babylon falls to the Persians in 539, and Cyrus allows the return of the people to their own lands, not just the people of Israel going back to Jerusalem, but the return of lots of people into their own lands. And about 50,000 people came back, and they called it the Aliyah, and that was the going up to Jerusalem. And they still talk about when you're making a pilgrimage up to Jerusalem, you're going on an Aliyah. 458 BC, you had Ezra, and the temple was rebuilt in 516. And the temple took a long time to be rebuilt, and as we've seen in our talks, it was started to be rebuilt, and then it stopped about knee high when they felt that the money was running out, and it just sat there for years and years, and eventually the temple got rebuilt under Ezra in 458 BC, and 445 or 444. The calendars are quite difficult to work out. You had Nehemiah coming back into the city, and the city walls were rebuilt, and the city of God was made secure from the tribes surrounding Jerusalem. Daniel was taken to Babylon in the first deportation and stayed there even past the last return. Daniel had a long lifespan, and he was a very popular under various rulers. They all recognized Daniel's quality, and they kept Daniel on despite being from a different religion and a different reign of people. The quality of the man just shines through. Daniel's life is captured between chapters 1 to chapter 6. Chapter 1 is about the deportation in 606 BC and his selection for the royal court of Babylon. It's very interesting that he has been given a Babylonian name, And he wasn't named after any old Babylonian, or he wasn't given a name after any old Babylonian. He was named after a Babylonian god, and he was named Belteshazzar. And he didn't object to that. That wasn't something that he objected to. I suppose it was a matter of, you've got to fight the battles that are most important to you. And Daniel's name wasn't overly a battle that he was bothered about fighting. They were quite happy to be called whatever, but they would not leave their God go. The crisis arose because they were being fed to be nice and fat, and being fat in that culture was a considered good. It was considered a sign of prosperity. But Daniel and his three friends did not accept that, and the four were being given the premium teaching of the University of Babylon. You remember that Moses, when he was in Egypt, was taught in the top university of Egypt, and the Cleopatra's Needle, which is in London, there were two of those, and those columns were built and placed right at the entrance to the Egyptian university. Well, likewise, there was a university in Babylon, and these four guys were taught there. But the man who was teaching them said that the king would have killed him if he didn't fatten them up properly. And then Daniel made a bargain with them that if they go on a diet that his God had chosen for him for a month, and then they could compare the students at the end of the month, and if Daniel and his friends weren't coming up to scratch, then they would adhere to his diet. And Daniel said, if they are not fitter and healthier than the other students, they will go on to their diet. It's interesting that Daniel made a stand for his principles in a very small way to start with. And that's how Daniel could face the lions, because Daniel made his stand in the small things, and he worked up to the lions. He didn't just jump in with them. And that's a profound lesson. If you stand your ground over small issues, then you are likely to stand your ground over larger issues. If you're faithful in the small things, then God will give you grace for the bigger things. And you form your character in the little things, and that enables you later, when the big crunches come, not to shift. It's people who are wobbly on the little things that fail in their big decisions. They were not only better in their health, but they were 10 times better in their studies. It was found out. Christians in university should strive to be the best at their studies that they can be, not the best in the world. chapter 2 of the book of Daniel starts the mysterious part of Daniel, and it begins with a monster. This is the only part in the first 6 chapters that puzzles people. Nebuchadnezzar had a dream, but he's forgotten his dream, and he asks his wise men to tell him the meaning of the dream and also tell him the dream, which is an impossibility. But he threatens them that they will lose their heads if they can't tell him the dream. They thought that that was rather unfair, and they were all afraid. But they said, no man can do that. And Daniel got them out of a spot to bother with this. And not only could he tell them what the meaning of the dream was, but he could tell Nebuchadnezzar what his dream was. And this was wisdom from God, and wisdom from God that was needed. The dream was of a giant, and as you work your way down the giant, the material that's used to create the giant, it gets worse and worse. The head is of gold, and the torso silver, the waist bronze, the legs iron, and the feet a clay mixed with iron. And the whole figure is an apocalyptic unveiling of future empires that will replace Babylon. Babylon was to be replaced by the Medo-Persian Empire, and as a mixture of the Medes and the Persians, but they were under Cyrus and Darius, and they were not in the same sort of realms of glory as Babylon. Nothing has touched Babylon for the sheer magnificence that they pervade. And then we come to the waist, the bronze era, and it's then the Greeks and Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great obliterated the Medes and the Persians. He got as far as India in terms of his conquerings, but built his capital, Persepolis, right where the Medes and the Persians had been. And you can still see the remains of his castles and empires there today. The Greeks were replaced by the Romans, and legs of iron, which is quite relevant in that it was the Roman armies that they were talking about, and they would be followed by the feet, which is a mixture of clay and iron, and that's a lot of different rulers and kings coming from different nations. It was God's first warning to King Nebuchadnezzar that God was in charge of kingdoms and not people. The whole of Daniel is saying that it is God who causes kingdoms to rise and fall. Kingdoms come and go, but it is God that decides when they come and when they go. And history is his story. And God is saying, I will bring these other empires after you. They won't have your magnificence, and they will gradually become weaker in human terms. But it's I who do this. And in other words, God is saying, mine is the kingdom, not yours. You are just the caretakers of it. In chapter 3, there's the infamous story of the fiery furnace. Nebuchadnezzar, probably because of his dream, had erected a 90-foot high statue, and he was 9 foot wide and covered in gold. Now, when you realize that Mesopotamia as a land is totally flat, as far as the eye can see, a statue that stands 90 foot tall would be impressive in those days and would have been seen for miles, and it would have dominated the landscape. And he made an order that whenever the band played, that everybody was to bow down to this idol. And it was a kind of established state religion. It was a quick way of uniting the empire around one religion. And Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego refused to bow down. Where Daniel was at this point, we don't know, but he wasn't involved in this. But Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego refused to bow down, and someone told tales on them, and they were thrown into the fiery furnace. And it was heated 7 times hotter than usual, to the extent that the guards taking these 3 into the fiery furnace all got killed. But when Nebuchadnezzar peered in through the mouth of the furnace, he could see 4 figures in the fire. And he said the one looked like the son of the gods. And that was his understanding, that was his explanation of what one of them looked like. And he said to his servant, didn't we throw 3 people in there? And now there's 4. So he pulls them back out, and they found when they came out that the fire had burnt the ropes on them, but hadn't even singed the hairs on their hands. And you can believe this story if you believe in God. But if you don't believe in God, it's a really odd story. But that was the start of anti-Semitism in the Babylonian Empire, because it became a feature of Babylon, this hatred of the Jews. Chapter 4 is about Nebuchadnezzar's madness, and he calls it a sign and a wonder. And through it, Nebuchadnezzar is converted. He married a queen, a beautiful princess from the mountains of Persia, roughly where Tehran is at present. And when she came to the palace, she was terribly homesick. She missed the mountainous regions and the trees and the wild animals. So he built her a mountain of brick on which he covered it with trees and plants, and it became the 7th one, or one of the 7 wonders of the world. Tourists flocked to the hanging gardens of Babylon, and on top of this mountain that he'd created for his queen, he put a private zoo. Right, he said, no more crying in my palace. You've got your mountains, you've got your forests, you've got your animals. Stop crying. And Saddam Hussein tried to recreate Babylon. He was recreating the Babylonian Empire when he was overthrown. But it was a half-size recreation, and it's never been completed. And it's probably half destroyed now. And the king was walking one day on his palace roof, and he said, "Is this Babylon not great, which I have built by my power for my glory?" And you get the reminiscences of the thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory from this. And God was jealous, and he needed to bring this king down a peg or 2. Nebuchadnezzar had a dream of a huge tree that reached the sky, and animals found shelter under it, and birds found shelter in it. And then the tree was cut down and bound in iron, and then it began to grow again from the stump. And Daniel told him what his dream was. He said, "The tree is you, Nebuchadnezzar, and you will be driven out from among men for 7 years, until you acknowledge the Most High God rules and gives the kingdoms of men to whomever he wishes." And Nebuchadnezzar forgot about that dream, and 1 year later God turns up and told him, "Nebuchadnezzar, what I told you about your dream is going to happen, and it's going to happen now." And God always gives a time for repentance, but Nebuchadnezzar had forgotten about the dream. And Nebuchadnezzar went absolutely crazy for 7 years. They had to lock him up in his own zoo. And he ate grass for 7 years. His hair grew like the feathers of an eagle. His nails grew like the claws of a bird. He became just like Howard Hughes at the end of his life. And at the end of 7 years, he lifted his eyes to heaven and said, "God, you are God." And God restored him to his throne, made him greater than he was before. And then he made a big mistake, because he tried to force people to worship the God of Israel. And he tried to force the people to worship the God of Israel, but he worshipped God for the rest of his life. And he said God had driven him mad before he could come to his senses. It's a hard way to get converted, but what an amazing story. Chapter 5 is the story of the end of Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar has now died, and Belshazzar has taken over, and he's given a big feast, and he wants to profane all the holy things. So he said, "Let's get all the holy things that we brought from the temple in Jerusalem, and let's use them for holding an orgy." And they were getting drunk and using the holy vessels that they brought from Jerusalem. And then suddenly he saw a finger writing on the wall, and it wrote, many tackles are passing. And he was curious as to what that meant, and he called for Daniel, and Daniel said, "You have been weighed, and you have been found wanting." And that very night, the Persians got into Babylon, and Babylon was finished. Babylon was destroyed. And Babylon was originally the home of the Temple of Babel. That's where Babylon comes from. And at that point, it was destroyed. Chapter 6 is Daniel in the lion's den. We are now under another king and another empire and another emperor. And we are under Darius. There's problems once again, and there's anti-Semitism once again in the kingdom. People are forced to worship the god the emperor wants them to, and people are forbidden to pray to any other gods for a period of a month. But Daniel was not going to be deterred. He had a habit of praying towards Jerusalem with an open window, looking far to the west where God's dwelling place had been. And he was taken and thrown into the lion's den for doing this. And it took an angel to hold the lion's mouth shut. And he was delivered again. Daniel is constantly being delivered out of all sorts of fun and games. And King Darius had to swallow his words. Daniel went on and on. He was a man whose quality and integrity was plain to see for everyone, regardless of the empire that he was working under. And they all wanted to make Daniel responsible for something. And gave him a high office. He was like the ultimate civil servant at the time. Regardless of who's in government, Daniel is always there advising them. He was a wonderful model and example for young men and young women to be the kind of young person that non-believers and pagans, whoever, will use because they recognize the integrity and the quality of the character. That's the end of the first 6 chapters of Daniel. We'll continue next week with the first 6 the second 6 chapters, and we'll possibly be out of this mess, but we've got to wait for the plastering to be finished, and then we're painting the room. So hopefully we'll be out of this mess, and hopefully we'll be getting back to normal. God bless you. Have a great day. Goodbye.